glad to see all of you here this morning, and Samantha, thank you very much for taking the lead with this symposium. Appreciate you and the team from the Journal. Thank you very much for your work. Events like this don't happen around here but for our students, and we want you to know how proud we are of you and thankful for what you're doing. In 2012, people woke up in the DC area to this news. If you look at the banner here, high school girls prostituted. And it was news about Fairfax County, Virginia, one of the wealthiest counties in Virginia. And they woke up to find, this is Neil McBride, he was the United States Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia. He was describing a sex trafficking ring that existed in Fairfax County, Virginia. It was run by a gang called the Underground Gangster Crips, and the gang had lured teenage girls, especially teenage girls, but also some adult women, into a sex trafficking ring. They recruited them online, at metro stations, and I think what shocked people most, from local high schools in the Fairfax County area. They often told the girls, and they tended to focus on girls who were either on the fringes of society or who were runaways, told them, this is a place where you can find the love and acceptance that you're missing in your life. They offered that. But what the girls found once they were fully engaged in this enterprise was that they faced abuse and violence. They were kept in their position where they were engaged in prostitution. They were kept under control by drugs, alcohol, physical and emotional abuse. The FBI reported this, that the gang's leader personally enforced his will through a mix of manipulation, intimidation, and where necessary force by chokings, beatings, and rape. Thankfully, after cooperation by the FBI and by the Attorney General's Office of Virginia, the ring was broken and a good number of gang leaders were prosecuted, some for up to 25 years in prison, and are serving sentences right now as a result of that. And I raise that at the beginning of our time because it was a shocking thing. And it was a shocking thing that this thing, human trafficking, that many people in Virginia had heard about, was happening right here. It wasn't just in India or in Cambodia where people tended to think it was occurring. It was occurring here. It occurs everywhere. In every part of society, in the wealthiest parts of society as well as in the poorest parts of society, and all over the world. And so, Samantha and team, I'm really glad that you're taking this issue on today, that you created this symposium. This is a critical issue that faces us domestically and around the world. And so I'm really looking forward to today and talking about this. I'm glad to see all of you here today. And one of the most fun things for me is seeing some of our alumni back who are here and participating in this. I'm so excited to know that you're out there making a difference in this field. And I think students who are here now, you'd be excited to see what some of the people who were sitting in your seats just a few years ago are already doing now in this area. So my job today, I think, is just to give you an overview of what is the world of human trafficking like? What's the scope of it? What forms does human trafficking take? And then you're going to hear much more from experts who are really engaged in the fight against human trafficking. So in terms of the reach of human trafficking, I want to just show you some numbers. And it's very hard to get accurate, precise numbers about human trafficking, but these are some of the best numbers that I could find. 45.8 million. That's the estimated number of people who are engaged in who are enslaved around the world today. So the number of people who are enslaved in some form of slavery. That's way more than at any time in human history, more than during the U.S. Civil War, more than at the time that William Wilberforce liberated slaves or helped end the slave trade in the British Empire. 800,000 is an estimated number of people who are trafficked across international borders every year. 5.5 million, the number of children who are trafficked globally. 100,000, the number of U.S. kids who are trafficked within the United States every year. And then 150.2 billion is the estimated amount of profit that's earned by the human trafficking industry. It is the third largest criminal enterprise, and it's the fastest growing criminal enterprise in So what is human trafficking? This is a definition of it that comes from the State Department in their Trafficking in Persons report. Excuse me. And so the definition, as you can see, is the act of recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, or obtaining a person for compelled labor or commercial sex acts. And then very important terms for at least adult human trafficking through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. And you'll see that if children are involved, it's not always necessary to prove force, fraud, or coercion, but for adult human trafficking, it is. So let's just talk about some of the forms that human trafficking takes. And the State Department mentioned two of them, labor trafficking and sex trafficking, but I want to talk about two others too that we're seeing around the world, organ trafficking and the use of child soldiers around the world. So in terms of labor trafficking, this is actually the most common form. If you talk about just a number of people who have been enslaved or who are forced to engage in services, I think labor trafficking would be number one around the world. And this takes place when individuals use force, fraud, or coercion to require other people to work in some way for them. And then this is a picture of Shaima Hall. And Shaima is a good example of what does labor trafficking look like. She was 8 years old when her parents sold her to another couple in Egypt. So her parents sold her to the couple. The couple moved to the United States. They brought Shaima with them. And so for years, they just worked Shaima. She worked for up to 20 hours per day. They kept her under control and kept her from escaping or talking to others by a variety of means. They abused her physically and emotionally. They kept her away from other people as much as possible. They kept her passport so that she wasn't able to go home or to go somewhere else. And they even used the inability to learn another language. They wouldn't let her learn English. They kept her away from anybody else so that she'd be as isolated as possible. So when she was released, she knew 3 English words. She knew hi, dolphin, and stepsister. That was all she had learned in the time in the United States. And this is what she told police when she was found. She said, "I now believe my captors intentionally kept anything from me that might teach me the language, because knowledge of English could have given me more power. Something captors do well is keep their slaves powerless." And I think you'll see that throughout the day as we talk about human trafficking, the variety of means that traffickers use to hold power and to keep the captives powerless. And in this case, even the use of language or the refusal to allow the use of language. Now, you may never have thought about organ trafficking. I certainly had not thought about the trafficking in organ as human trafficking. But this is a form of human trafficking that takes place when individuals are forced or tricked into giving up an organ. Sometimes this takes place during a medical procedure sometimes an individual is told, hey, you need this procedure. They undergo a procedure that maybe they do need it. Sometimes they don't. They're just told they need it, and an organ is taken at that time. Or it can also occur when somebody has agreed to sell an organ. This actually takes place around the world a lot, but they're not paid for it, or they're not paid what they had been told they would be paid. So let me give you an example of organ trafficking. And the examples that I'm giving you actually come out of the State Department's Trafficking in Persons report. Every year the State Department puts out this report on trafficking that takes place around the world. And so I believe it was the 2009 report talked about Mohammed Khan. He was a 33-year-old Indian man. And he was offered a construction job a few hours away from his home. So he moved to a new city. He was going to be paid $4 a day to work in this construction job. But when he got there, the first thing he was told was, come into this room, you need to give us a blood sample. They took blood, but they also gave him a drug that rendered him unconscious. And so when he woke up, the first thing he saw was a man standing over him with a surgical mask, and the man said this: "We have taken your kidney. If you tell anyone, we will shoot you." He was never paid for the kidney. It took months for him to recover from what took place here. A good example of this, of organ trafficking. It's very hard to know how much organ trafficking takes place. When I was trying to do some research and find area was one of the hardest ones to find statistics on. But there are at least 110,000 organ transplants that take place every year. The problem is that's about 10% of the need. And so there's a huge demand for organs, and people are willing to pay money for those organs. And I guess you should know that simply paying money for an organ or selling an organ, that's not considered trafficking. It's only considered trafficking if the person's organ is just taken from them, or it's taken by trickery, or the money isn't paid that was promised. One of the really, again, this is another area where I knew very little about it, but learned that there's this whole world, it's called transplant tourism. Transplant tourism, where people will travel to another country to donate an organ, or travel to another country to receive an organ. And it's often in these international transactions that trafficking takes place, where organs are stolen, where they're taken without pay. And I just want to read you one quote from the World Health Organization to kind of give you a glimpse of what happens. What do we mean when we talk about organ trafficking? So the World Health Organization said, in some cases, live donors have been reportedly brought from the Republic of Moldova to the United States, or from Nepal to India. In other cases, both recipients and donors from different countries travel to a third country. More than 100 illegal kidney transplants were performed at St. Augustine Hospital in South Africa in 2001 and 2002. Most of the recipients came from Israel. The donors were from Eastern Europe and Brazil. The police investigation in Brazil and South Africa revealed the existence of an international organ trafficking syndicate. So it's big business trafficking in organs. Third form of human trafficking is what's known as child soldiering, or the use of child soldiers. This happens in combat settings around the world. And I'm guessing some of you know of the man that's in the upper left corner of this slide, Joseph Kony. Became famous or notorious, especially around 2012, when a group called Invisible Children sought to bring attention to him and the Lord's Resistance Army, which he led in Uganda. And he and the LRA kidnapped about 38,000 kids and forced them to engage in a conflict with the Ugandan army. How does it work? I mean, essentially what they do is they kidnap boys and girls, and the boys are usually forced to fight. Girls are usually forced to become cooks or messengers or sex slaves for those who are combatants. And how do they do it? They essentially try to drive these kids, they kidnap them, and then they abuse them and bring them to the point of almost the physical or emotional breaking point, to the point where they will just obey any order that they are given just to try to survive, and then they use them in conflict. At the bottom is Thomas Lubanga, and Lubanga was the very first man convicted by the International Criminal Court. And so the first conviction the ICC ever had was for Thomas Lubanga, and his crime was using children under 15 in combat. And so he's now serving a term of 14 years in prison in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And so it's hard to know exactly how many children are being used in this way, but the best estimate I saw was about 300,000 kids. How do you imagine 300,000 children being forced to engage in being a soldier, or girls being cooks, messengers, or sex slaves for them? And then the final form of human trafficking that I just wanted to mention briefly is sex trafficking. And that was the story that I told you at the beginning when I told you about what took place in Fairfax County, Virginia. It's a form of sex trafficking that took place. And this is how the State Department defines sex trafficking. So for an adult, it's engaging in commercial sex acts such as prostitution, again, as a result of force, fraud, coercion, or any combination of such means. That person is being trafficked. For a child, there need be no proof of force, fraud, or coercion. Simply using a child in a commercial sex act would be human trafficking. This happens a lot, and I find these numbers to be shocking. So for kids who are being sexually exploited, who are forced into prostitution, this is the average age, according to at least one study, in which which kids begin to be forced into such acts. For girls, it's 12 to 14 years old when they begin. For boys, it's even younger, 11 to 13 years. It's just the level of depravity in this is astounding. I want to read you a quote. Columnist Yamiche Alcindor did some reporting, trying to figure out, well, what happens? How does this occur? What takes place? When does it occur? Who's doing this? And she shared just 3 examples of some kids who were sold into sex trafficking. She writes, one girl was sold during a sleepover, handed over by her classmate's father. Another slept with clients during her school lunch breaks. A third was choked by her, quote, boyfriend, and then forced to have sex with 14 men in one night. And it's happening thousands and thousands of times in the U.S. and around the world. And so I want to close my time by just sort of asking, how does this happen? And I think as we explore this today and talk about what can be done, how should we attack this? What can be done about this? Are there changes that we can make in law or in prosecution that can make a difference? I guess I want to talk briefly about there's a basic problem about the way we view human beings. I think there's a human nature problem at the root of what takes place here. And so 2 things that I want you to remember, or at least strike me. One is, why does this occur? One is, it reflects the depravity of the human heart. That there is evil in the world and inside the human heart. This again is Neil McBride, who was the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia, who prosecuted the underground gangster Crips in Fairfax County. And he says these cases are as horrific and brutal and vile as any cases we see. I think this is an area where the darkness of the human heart is lived out and flourishes. That's part of what takes place in human trafficking. The other thing is, I think this can only occur in every form of human trafficking because people view others not as people worth of value, as people who are made in the very image of God, as we know as Christians is true, but they're viewed as objects, as things to be used, to be bought or sold. And I don't know the source of this quote, but I find this to be powerful. It says, people were created to be loved. Things were created to be used. The reason why the world is in chaos is because things are being loved and people are being used. And to just close with a couple of quotes to show you that this is indeed what takes place in human trafficking. A couple of professors about a decade ago interviewed people who were the buyers of trafficking victims, both in labor and sex trafficking. And I want to read you what they said about why they did what they did and how they viewed the transaction. This is from an Indian man. He works for the government. He's 54 years old. And actually, okay, I'll read this one. Same situation, except he's 39 years old. He says this. He says, if she, the prostitute, takes money and does not perform what she is expected to, then the customer will get angry. See, I understand the prostitute is there in the first place because she has no choice or is forced there. I feel bad about this, especially if she is forced or sold. But the fact is that she is in the flesh market. The rules of the market apply to her as well as to one who has come out of her own choice. It may sound bad, but the fact is that she is a commodity, offering a service, and she should accept that. We should all. So just this conscious, I know she's being trafficked, I know she's there against her will, but she's there, she's a commodity, she's got to accept that. And then one example of labor trafficking, this is from a British employer who has a foreign worker in their home who she has exploited at this point and kept without paying her, or at least paying her the appropriate amount of money. And she explains why it is that she likes using trafficked people as opposed to hiring somebody who's a legal domestic worker. She says they're foreign, they're illegal, they're scared and timid, so they're not going to take up space. They're going to be very, very small, and that is generally easier to live with than someone who feels that this is their home. They're in really bad situations. They're terrified. And that explains why she's glad to be using trafficked victims. And again, I think it goes to this. Whatever we talk about today, whatever solutions we propose, better take into account human beings are made in God's image, with worth and value and dignity. We need to treat them as persons instead of commodities. And so, thanks for your attention. I look forward to discussing this more and hearing more about, so what do we do about this situation?
Sold to meet a demand for sex. Across the globe, children are...
Good morning. I'm Breyer, Policy Counsel with Sheriff International. And so I'm here to talk with you this morning about two of our key focus areas, addressing demand and ensuring victim identification. And so we'll start with a short video.
Across the globe, children are victims of sex trafficking, sold to meet a demand for sexual services. This horrific crime happens right here in the United States, and each year, thousands of America's children are lured into sexual slavery.
It was the things that he said were things that I've never felt before. I actually felt like I was loved by somebody for the first time. And I put all of my trust and all of my faith in him. And the way that he got me was he told me, let's go for a ride. I gotta pick something up in Indianapolis. And he said we were coming back that night. So I drove with them out to Indianapolis. And when we got out there, that's when he told me we were going back.
Those who profit from this form of modern-day slavery do not discriminate, and the victim can be anyone's child. In the United States, the average age of recruitment is 13 years old.
When I turned 12 years old, I started street prostitution. I had a pimp.
We're all under 18. We're all the same age. There would be a few girls that I knew that were like in their 20s or whatever, but they had been doing it since they were our age anyways. I did wait till 12, and these girls were doing it since they were like 8 or 9, and now they're like 23.
Do you know how many people get kidnapped? You know, most of our clients have been kidnapped many times by pimps. I was thrown, in a car kidnapped by a pimp before too. They see you, they don't think you're with someone, or they don't know that person. But they kidnap you and they beat you and they force you to go with them. And that's so they sell you to others. The same things that happen overseas happens here, and we need to understand that.
It's not always just the poor kids. A lot of times it's the really rich kids, and you're like, what are you doing out here? And it's because their mom and dad are never home. They don't care about that.
Young victims are beaten, raped, and held in physical and psychological bondage. Fearing for their lives, they are often too terrified to run away.
He would beat me with broomsticks, candles. He would burn me with candles. He would take metal hangers and beat me with them, or poke me with them, belts, anything that he could get his hands on, he would beat me with. The one time he had beat me so bad that he had ruptured my spleen and put me in the intensive care unit. So it's like, once you knew that he could almost kill you, you'd rather do what he says than get beat again.
Shared Hope's human rights investigators have uncovered an underground market for America's youth, a market that is driven by demand.
You pay the price, you get what you want, I get it for you. Really? Now, if you want something really young, that 200 will cost you, just cost a little more than that. Sure. Come in.
Well, hang on, get ahead.
Well, I don't think that's younger than 14.
Okay, now 14 is good.
Okay.
Yeah, that'd be great. So the girls over here cost 2, is it?
That's the women.
The women?
Now, if I told you 2, and you want something younger, I tell you this is add something to it, just tell me, you just pick a figure to that.
I guess, what, 3?
3. You got it.
Our children are being sold. day after day like product, all to meet the demand for paid sex.
I want to show them and tell them like what it feel like to be that hoe, to be degraded all the time, to be hit on, to be manipulated, to be sold all day, every day. Who was there to stop it? Nobody was there to stop it.
So much of the undercover footage from the video we just saw stemmed from research that Shared Hope did for the Demand Report, which examined the sex trafficking markets in 4 countries. But before we get into that, I want to give you Unfortunately, cultural norms continue to hinder efforts to fight demand. In the United States, this failure to recognize buyers as serious offenders and this boys will be boys mentality has even halted recent legislation. I believe it was in New Hampshire this session, there was a bill in place that would have increased penalties for buyers. And it actually failed when a female legislator made the comment that boys will be boys. That doesn't mean they're trafficking perpetrators. And so really in minimizing the role that demand and the buyers play, we've seen continuous pushback in certain states. Globally, countries that have higher tolerance for personal autonomy, commercial sex, and those that place a low value on women, particularly those of a low socioeconomic status, continue to push back in the fight against demand. And so it was really the research that Shared Hope conducted for the demand report that catalyzed our shift in focus from international sex trafficking to child sex trafficking within the United States. Because children are uniquely susceptible to the problems of child sex trafficking, Shared Hope saw this as the opportunity to bring this aspect of trafficking out of the shadows. And so our efforts now, they focus on domestic policy, but we still focus on addressing demand and ensuring that victims are properly identified as victims. When we started researching child sex trafficking laws in the United States, many of the people who were interacting with these victims on a regular basis didn't believe that sex trafficking happened in the United States, let alone in their own communities, which meant a large number of these victims weren't being identified and that they weren't given the services that they needed to reclaim their lives. Now we have thousands of ambassadors of hope across the country that volunteer to become trained kind of in our mission and to bring justice and healing to victims and just on kind of generally what trafficking is. And then they take this into their communities. Because informed communities need informed families. Informed families can better protect their children, and those children can better protect their peers. Informed communities also mean that we can coordinate with others to, and other NGOs and advocates to focus on finding solutions and to identify best practices for dealing with the issue. One way that we at Shared Hope help shape best practices is through our Protected Innocence Challenge. We use a legislative framework that kind of addresses 6 key areas to a comprehensive, coordinated response to child sex trafficking. We look at the laws themselves, how they apply to buyers, facilitators, traffickers. We look at protective responses available to sex trafficking survivors, and then law enforcement training tools. We then release a 45 to 60-page report for each state that compares their laws against our framework, and then we provide recommendations for ways that states can address gaps in their law. We then grade each state based on the strength of their laws, not as a criticism, but as a call to action. We also issue a report card to each of these states, and it's been interesting seeing kind of the response to these reports. We'll get a call from attorney generals, legislators, advocates, and they'll have our report card in hand and they'll say, neighbor state just got an A, so what do we need to do? And so this really provides us with an opportunity to advocate around some of these key issues, to provide technical assistance and growing trend toward the non-criminalization of minors for prostitution offenses. Since 2000, 23 states and the District of Columbia have enacted legislation that eliminates criminal liability for some or for all minors. Non-criminalization like this is fundamental to identify victims as victims rather than as willing participants, and to confirm that paying for sex, the demand, does not sanitize the underlying crime of child rape. One of the myths that we frequently encounter on the victim identification front is that as soon as a victim is given the opportunity, that they'll identify themselves as a victim. But that's oftentimes not the case. Many of these children have been so traumatized and manipulated by their traffickers that they don't trust anyone, nor do they see their exploiter as their trafficker as their exploiter. Oftentimes they don't recognize their own victimization. Some may even believe that they're in love with their trafficker. And for others, as we've seen in the video, the relationship with their trafficker is the first time that they felt safe or protected, at least until the abuse started. In other countries, being trafficked may even be seen as an honor. I was recently talking with a friend of mine who spent a summer serving child sex trafficking victims in India, and time again she heard them say what an honor it was because they were considered desirable enough to be trafficked. And so much remains to be done to changing these cultural attitudes. And so, as we've seen, shifting perceptions about buyers, and on the other end of the aisle, shifting perceptions about victims, operate as two sides of the same coin. The same cultural shift that is necessary for us to see buyers as serious offenders requires us to see the victims as victims, not as criminals, who willingly participate in this exploitation. And so, although addressing both of these areas of the law have definitely been challenging culturally and legally, both are critically important to ending the victimization of children through child sex trafficking. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Sarah. And I have a question for you, which I hope we'll have some time for questions at the end of this. I'm so very happy to be here at this 4th annual, and I think I was at the first one, and glad to be at the 4th one. I'm just going to zip through my presentation so that we have a little time. Do we have a little time for Q&A afterwards? Great. You've heard sort of the global view from your professor, and then something about the demand side and how that triangle of activity, supply, demand, distribution, that demand aspect of the buyers who fuel the market is so important. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about some work that I have been doing, that I came to be doing in a kind of a roundabout way, because actually Global Centurion also works on the demand side. But I've been doing this work for so long that when a colleague who worked with SBA List, the pro-life anti-abortion organization, came to me and said, is there a connection between abortion and trafficking, do you think? And I said, from my conversations with survivors, I was sure there was, but I didn't know how much. And she said, do you think we could find out? And I said, I think we could, but we would have to ask the survivors themselves. And that's how I came to be doing. I was funded by a private pro-life donor to go out into the United States and in 20 cities to interview survivors about their experiences. And we decided that we would put the issue of abortion in a larger context of health consequences of human trafficking. Let's see, which one is the one that the answer? Okay, great. So we decided that we wanted to do this in a way that we could hear the full stories of the survivors, and we've now gone to 20 cities, interviewed 300 survivors, and we heard all from them, and this one I chose because it kind of encompasses all of the kinds of health consequences. He said, when I turned 13, I'd had enough of the abuse at home. And I didn't know where to go, so I ran away. I stood out by the town hall, and a man saw me hanging out there. And he came up to me and he said, started a conversation, and he said to me, I'm looking for a protege. And I thought, well, I don't know what that is, but it sounds good to me. And he said, do you have a place to stay? And I told him I didn't. And so he said, you can stay at my house until you get settled. So I went with him, and when I got there, he pulled out a drink, and he gave it to me, and I drank one drink, and the next thing I knew, I woke up the next morning all sick and wet and hurt. He took me out that day onto the street, and he told me what I had to do. When I said I didn't want to do that, he then threatened me with a gun, and he pistol whipped me, and that's how I got into this life, and I couldn't get out. Over the next year, he hit me, he punched me, he beat me, he kicked me, he slashed me with a razor. I had forced unprotected sex with customers. I got pregnant twice. I had 2 abortions. I had hepatitis C, STDs, stomach problems, back pain, and a lot of psychological issues. I overdosed on drugs twice, and I was taken to the hospital where they saved me, but then they released me back to my family. So this is kind of, it encompasses a lot of the health issues that we encountered, the physical, the mental, the substance abuse, the violence, the forced abortions, all of that is a part of this. These were all domestic survivors in the United States, in cities across our own country, who were experiencing this. So what we did was we gathered, when we first started this work, people said, you won't be able to get survivors to talk about this, you won't be able to get enough of them to have a good sample size. So we decided on a mixed methods approach. In every city that we went to, I contacted the shelters that were working, like Shared Hope and others, that were working with survivors, or I contacted a survivor that I knew from the work that we've been doing. And I asked them, could we come in and could you get a small round table of, we called them focus groups of survivors together. And when we started, we had usually 7 to 10, but by the time we were into year 2, the word would travel, oh, they're coming into town, and we would have, RSVPs for maybe 3 or 4, and then we'd get into the room and there were 20 or 30 survivors who wanted to tell us what had happened to them and to work with us to make sure this wasn't happening to anybody else. So we used a series of structured interviews where we had them tell us their stories, from the recruiting, transporting, what was the trafficker like, did he have a circuit, how much did he charge, what was your average day like, what were the kinds of things you encountered, and then sort of getting into some of the health issues. And then we broke for lunch, we had childcare, we sort of set it up in a setting that we thought was safe and secure and would help people to be able to talk about what had happened to them. And then we, after lunch, we gave them a survey, and you'll see an example of it. And in that way, it was 4 pages. We could also collect the quantitative data. So we had qualitative and quantitative data when we finished the study. We took the questions from the survey, from the International Statistical Classification of Diseases and Related Problems. It's the WHO, it's used all around the world, the diagnostic codes for diseases and violence and other kinds of health issues. And then we also asked a series of open-ended questions about healthcare providers, because we wanted to know, did you go anywhere while you were sick? And what type of facilities did you visit? And did the healthcare provider know that you were being trafficked? And so that was one of the pages. And then we got into a much more focused series of questions about reproductive issues. Did the victim use birth control? Where was the birth control obtained? What about pregnancies, miscarriage, abortion, forced abortion, morning after pill, live births? And then there were some other questions surrounding that, sterilization, infertility, all of those kinds of questions that survivors told us nobody ever asked us this before. And this is just one example of the questionnaire. When I was talking to some of my colleagues, they said, why didn't you have something like the SAT test where they could fill in the dots? And we said, no, we didn't want that. We wanted this to be user-friendly. We didn't want anybody to feel like they were taking a test or they would be frightened by what we were asking them, or is there a correct answer or not. So we just put a list and we kind of categorized them as they were in the ICD-10. Neurological problems, respiratory problems, gastro problems, cardio problems, that kind of thing. And then the main kinds of psychological issues, depression, anxiety, panic attacks, irritability, flashbacks, nightmares, suicidal ideation, those kinds of things. And then a series on substance abuse and a series of questions on reproduction, and a series of questions. And here, I mean, this was what was the most phenomenal to me was when you ask them about physical violence. All you could see, almost everything was circled here. Beaten, kicked, punched, slashed. Had a gun held to my head, threatened with a weapon, all of those kinds of things. And almost all of them were like this. And that's why when people say to me, well, prostitution is one thing and force, fraud, and coercion is another, we found that in almost every case where people thought they were being prostituted, that there was so much violence that went along with it that really that force, fraud, and coercion is built into the quote-unquote business. And then we asked about where they went for help, and here you can see somebody's a certain Planned Parenthood and a women's health clinic. And did the nurse know? Obviously. And did the doctor and nurse know? It was obvious, she said. But did they ask you anything about it? No, she says. And then all these issues about birth control, condoms, who got the birth control for you, did you have children? I knew there was abortion in trafficking, but I was actually shocked, even though I worked on this issue for 20 years, I was shocked at how many children were born into trafficking situations. We had hundreds of children were recorded on these surveys being born into the trafficking situation. How many children did you give birth to? She says 4 here. Where did you have them in the hospital? Were you given the morning after pill? No, ever. How many abortions did you have? This person says 17 abortions while she was being trafficked. This is from a street gang. She was trafficked when she was 13 in Tennessee. The guy was the head of a street gang, or actually a motorcycle outlaw gang, criminal motorcycle gang. And she was trapped in that trafficking situation until she was almost 30. He was very vicious, and he ran a gang, and he had a whole, almost a trailer city where all of the outlaw motorcycle gang lived. And she turned on him when he said, "You're getting too old for this. You have to go and recruit from the middle schools." And she said, "No, I won't do it," because she had been through so much. And when we had a conversation with her, she said she was just so sick and so hardly able to move, and she just didn't want to wish that on anybody. And his brother was the head of the police force in that small town, so he was always getting tipped off whenever there was going to be a raid or any kind of thing that was going to happen federally or statewide. He knew because of his local law enforcement connection. So she knew also about that, and so she went to another city and she reported him, and he's now in jail. He's one of those federal cases that was prosecuted. He's in jail for a good 30 years. So you can see, and she remembered where all of those abortions had taken place, and she was able to tell us it was the same corner, same Planned Parenthood. So now I have a series of slides, and I'll zip through them because they're available online. My article is available online, and you can get these online. Any physical problems? Obviously, 99.1% said that they had physical problems. neurological problems, health problems, injuries, cardiovascular, gastrointestinal, and dental, surprisingly. And now people say, well, not so surprisingly, but because they very rarely went to a dentist. Did you have psychological problems? Again, not surprisingly, 98.1% had some kind of psychological problem. Depression, 88% had depression. Flashbacks, 68% had flashbacks from some of the terrible things that had happened to them. Shame and guilt, post-traumatic stress syndrome, and attempted suicide. This is like 5 times the rate of attempted suicide in our country. 41.5% said they tried to commit suicide at least once during the time that they were trafficked. So you can see that there are physical, there are psychological. 71.2% said they got pregnant at least once while they were being trafficked. And then 22% said they got pregnant 5 times or more while they were being trafficked. So obviously whatever kind of birth control was being used was not being utilized well. 67.3% said they had at least one kind of STD. 55%, over half, said they had at least one abortion. 29.1% said they had multiple abortions while they were in the trafficking situation. I don't have that on the slides because I was trying to tabulate very quickly for Congress what we had found. 54.7% said they miscarried, and that's also not surprising given what they were being forced to do, but also we wondered whether that was a euphemism for abortion, that some of them were, because when we asked them, some of them said, nobody ever asked me that before, and you know, these were very painful things to talk about for them. 46.2% pain during sex or some kind of infection, and so on. Just keep going here really quickly. And then violence. Violence was another thing that we found. 95.1% had some kind of violence. 81% said forced sex. Then punched, beaten, kicked. We unpacked this because oftentimes when you say force, fraud, or coercion, people just don't know what that means. You have to ask, did this happen? Did this happen? Did this happen? Did this happen? And they go, oh yeah, that happened. That happened on a regular basis. I mean, we heard all kinds of terrible stories about the kinds of punishment the trafficker you know, would inflict if they didn't do what he wanted them to do. We also heard all kinds of violence that they endured from their customers. We heard about you know, being forced to have sex with a gun at your head. You know, so all kinds of terrible, frightening things that happened. One survivor said, whenever my trafficker was mad at me, he would hang me in a closet strapped to a special wooden hanger, close the closet, hang me there for 24 hours, and when I got out, my shoulders were dislocated, and then they would have to be put back in. So crazy kinds of things that we heard about. And then substance abuse and trafficking. 84.3% said that they were, you know, there was some kind of abuse or addiction in their trafficking situation. 59.8% said it mainly alcohol. 53.4% said marijuana, cocaine, crack cocaine, heroin, ecstasy, PCP, and then we had an other. In every one of these categories we had an other, and we always heard about things like that red balls. We had never heard of that before. Well, that's when you take an illegal substance and you mix it with an over-the-counter substance, and you get, you know, supposedly an even stronger or better, you know, reaction from it. So, and then these survivors said to us, oftentimes they said, this wasn't forced on me, I begged for it because I could not go out there and do what I was being forced to do without some kind of substance to numb me from the pain. And then others said, well, my trafficker gave it to me until I was addicted, and then in order to get my fix, I had to go out and do it. So, you know, there are a lot of places where we need more study to understand exactly what's happening with this. A couple people said, I was addicted to drugs, and so then I got into the trafficking in order to pay my daily amount for my fix. Victim contact with health providers. This is where we stopped. We were planning to get a sample size of 300, and we stopped midway in order to publish our findings because we found that 87.8% had been to a healthcare provider while they were trapped in the trafficking situation, and that the healthcare provider had treated what was in front of them and then sent them back to the trafficker. And it's not the provider's fault, because the provider has the mission and mandate of, okay, there's a broken bone, let's set it and go home. But unless the providers know about what trafficking is and can put what they're seeing in the slavery context, and then help to intervene, create an intervention of some sort, so that they can rescue or design an exit strategy for these victims, this will be an ongoing problem. So when we started this, when you think of that triangle of activity, supply, demand, distribution, we thought this was the distributors, that's the Department of Justice, they have to go after the traffickers. And we thought, the victims, well, that's Health and Human Services. We have to have services, tailored services for the survivors. But we never thought this is also a health issue. It's a huge health issue that we need to have tailored kinds of training that will help those providers understand trafficking, be able to identify the traffickers and the trafficking victims, and then respond appropriately, whatever that response can be. Last slide, where were abortions performed? 67.6% said that they were in clinics, 16.2% said they were in hospitals, and from what we would always ask them, why were you in a hospital for an abortion? Well, usually it was because the clinic that they had gone to botched it, and then they were, rushed to a hospital, into the emergency ward where they had to be, the abortion had to be finished. Some said to us, well, we heard all kinds of stories. We heard my pimp's grandmother was a nurse, and she had a clinic down the basement, and that all the pimps in the neighborhood would bring their girls there, and she would perform these abortions in her basement for them. And somebody else said, my trafficker knew a doctor, and we had what was called backdoor policy. We would come in the back door after hours when he was done at 5 o'clock, and he would perform the abortion, and then we would pay in oral sex. So we had all kinds of stories other than the usual clinic, corruption and illegal kinds of activities that are going on. One more slide, I guess. What type of birth control? 52% said condoms, but many of them said, well, that was what we were supposed to use, but oftentimes the buyer didn't, or the exploiter didn't want to use them. 22% said multiple. 11% said their trafficker had taken them to a doctor and gotten them Depo-Provera shots. And 10% said they were on the pill, and 3% said they were had IUDs. And this is just to show you the consequences, the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual consequences of trafficking. The top row and the bottom row. The top row is one person. This 1 year of mugshots, basically. The top one's from San Francisco. The bottom one's from Arizona. You can see they start out very, looking healthy and happy, and then at the very end there, they just look so completely devastated. And this is why we need to be attacking this from all angles. We definitely need the victim services, but we also need the traffickers. We need to go after the traffickers, and we need to go after the buyers. This is a multiple-pronged intervention that we need to do. So what to do about it? So very quickly, because we can talk about this in the back and forth, but I said 1 T and 4 Rs, and we've begun this working with the Department of Health and Human Services. We said health providers need training. They need to know the nature and scope of the problem, they need to know the law, they need to know the health consequences, they need to know indicators for identifying children, they need to know guidelines and protocols for what to do. And it needs to be sector specific, because one reason, it wasn't that health providers didn't have training, it's that they were getting this tip 101 training, you know, sort of a global training, and they would walk out and go, well, what does that have to do with me? Nothing. So we need it to be case specific, we need to have case studies, we need to have it so that they understand how they will encounter it in their profession. And then it needs to be even more specific to doctors, nurses, dentists, psychiatrists, psychologists, pharmacists, pharmacy associations. I'm going to tell you a story I was just telling the professor. And then we need to unpack what this looks like. How to make the harm visible to health providers. What does force mean? You know, and sort of all those terms that you might have to ask somebody, what happened to you? Who did this to you? How did it happen to you? In what context did it happen to you? Sort of trying to figure out or get the person to talk. And many of these survivors said, if somebody had only asked me a question about what was happening to me, but nobody did. They just treated what was in front of them and then sent me back out again. So, you know, trying to figure out and trying to work with and build that trust is going to be very important. And these first responders, health providers, are practically the only ones who might have somebody in a situation where they could ask those kinds of questions and build that kind of trust. So, and these are the different kinds of what's physical coercion look like, what does psychological coercion look like. One survivor said to me, he never touched me, he never beat me, he never hurt me, but he took me down the basement and he showed me a slab of cement, and on it was a girl about my age dead. And he said to me, that'll happen, that's what will happen to you if you don't do what I say. And I knew he was telling me the truth. I believed him, and that's how I, you know, was trapped in this. Some of them had threats to their family. The survivors told us, I thought I was protecting my younger sister. They said they would go after her if I didn't do that. So all of these kinds of things are, you know, they're against the law. They're elements of proving a case against the trafficker, and so they're very important to ferret out. So I'm just going to show you what I just was at the largest pharmacy association in the country, pharmacists were like, often we were saying, well, they probably have a peripheral role. There were 2,500 pharmacists in the audience here, and I told one story that I had heard from a Florida survivor who said, I was sold by my dad to pay off a gambling debt. We also contacted the Department of Justice when we heard this story, because she said, after a day when he lost at a gambling table a lot of money, within a day, he knew who to contact, and they knew who to sell to, and they knew how to get me across the border, and they knew what trailer brothel to send me to. So this is very organized, sophisticated criminal activity. The trafficker purchased 1,000 condoms a week in a box from the local CVS. And she said, you know, I would go in with him and he would just go right up to the counter and he would get 1,000 condoms. And who uses 1,000 condoms a week? Why wouldn't somebody at the CVS say something, do something? Nobody was trained. Nobody knew what to say. Nobody, you know, so we need that kind of, you know, sector-specific training that will help a pharmacist understand when you see this, you need to do this. Here's another one. A survivor from Minnesota said, I was 16 when I was trafficked. I was young, I was blonde, I was much in demand. Most of the men didn't want to wear a condom. So my trafficker gave me the morning after pill a lot. And my body is still recovering 5 years later. So after every time that she thought she might be pregnant, boom, that's what he would administer. And it was easy to get it. I just learned at this, at the end of February, February when I was at this Pharmacists Association that there are these new laws that are going into place called expedited partner therapies, and CLIA waived amendments that make it possible in 40 states in the United States for pharmacists to serve as doctors for any kind of quick test for all the serious communicable diseases, hepatitis, strep, TB, any of those kinds of diseases, for all the STDs, for all pregnancy tests, anything where you can do a quick test to find it. They can give the test, they can administer the medicine, and no doctor has to be seen at all. And this is because, well, the reason for this is because there's a shortage of doctors in both rural and urban areas, and so pharmacists are more and more being called on to play this role. And the man who wrote this, these two laws, which have been adopted in so many places and federally in one of the cases, said, well, I had no idea when I was doing this that there would be this underbelly, that traffickers would probably bring their victims to the pharmacist because it's easy, it's anonymous, it's quick. So we need to get to those chain drugstores that have the minute clinics. I mean, all of those need to be trained up now, and they need that kind of sector-specific training. And this is the last one. A Texas survivor said, here were my pimp's rules. No family, no friends allowed. No one could know where we lived at all. If anyone found out where we lived, we would move. No hanging out whatsoever when I'm not working, because basically, in the house because of my age. I was supposed to be in school and I was a runaway, so I couldn't ever be out anywhere. Wear makeup all the time, make myself look older. Never look my pimp in the eye. He was my master. Always use condoms. He went with me to the drugstore to purchase them, but she was never allowed to look at him. And after I showed these slides, I had a line of pharmacists saying, I had something like that, but I didn't know what to do. What could we do? What's the right thing to do? And so then we need to have, what to do about it. Well, we're developing a training in the Department of Health and Human Services called SOAR, Stop, Observe, Ask, Respond to Human Trafficking. And it's tailored for doctors and nurses, and it's tailored for social workers, and I'm hoping to convince them to do one for pharmacists now that, that I've encountered this. And it will teach them what to look for and what the indicators are, and if they suspect, what to do. One would be, and here we're into the 4 R's, referral, because you can refer. I used to get referring and reporting mixed up, but referring is any agency in your vicinity who's doing anti-trafficking work or something like that. You can refer if you can figure out a way to get that information to the victim across the counter. You can report, and in some cases, mandatory reporting is required if there's a child that's being trafficked. HIPAA is not a barrier to, HIPAA is the Privacy Act on health. You can report anonymously to the national hotline. And I know there's a lot of debate about what, the back and forth about reporting, and that providers don't want to do it oftentimes because it gets them into paperwork, and they don't want to be law enforcement. But in this case, if you know that the alternative is that you may be facilitating trafficking, wittingly or unwittingly, reporting is just critical to saving lives. This is the slide that we had the Health and Human Services create to say, if there's a trafficking situation, you can report, because HIPAA says disclosure for injury or abuse is permitted. You talked, Sarah, about the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act. One other part of that, in addition to the patronizing and soliciting added to the definition of sex trafficking, is in addition to the Child Abuse Act. When we, 2 years ago, child trafficking was not considered child abuse, and so it couldn't be treated under the Child Abuse Act. So we had to add a provision that says a child shall be considered a victim of child abuse and neglect if they are identified as a victim of sex trafficking, so that that could be that all of our agencies that deal with child abuse could step in, because they were, before that, they were saying, oh, that's trafficking, that's not a part of Child Protective Services. So we had to make it a part of Child Protective Services. And then next R is research. We need a lot of research, and some of you may be in a position to help us with this. We need to know so much more, because if we have good knowledge, we can design good programs. These were just a couple. I think children born into trafficking situations, we need to know so much more. We heard anecdotally about the kind of intergenerational, if they were born into trafficking, by the time they were 13, 14, 15, they were already, primed in some way to be trafficked into prostitution when they were adolescents. And so those are the kinds of things we need to know a lot more about, and we need to know how to intervene to stop the cycle of violence. Trauma-informed care in TIP victims. So many of our survivors said, when I was in that room, I was having PTSD, I was having flashbacks, I was freaked out, and the doctor made it worse, because he came in and he poked and he prodded me and he pushed and he didn't, they didn't know what situation I was in. And so having him look at me to examine me to see if I had a sexually transmitted disease was, that was scary. Or dentists, because there's been so much intrusion that having somebody go into your mouth is scary. So we need to train those who are doing this kind of work so that they're trauma informed, and so on. Reproductive issues, gang involvement that you talked about, all of these we need to know so much more about in order to design good programs to intervene. And finally, resources. First responders can benefit from Department of Health and Human Services SOAR trainings. We need to know what the local resources are, and then we need more funds. We need more funds. The Violence Against Women Act, the VAWA, provides $5 billion for spousal abuse every year, which filters down into the domestic violence shelters. But we have nothing like that for trafficking victims. It's catch as catch can. Most of them are hand to mouth. They don't have the stability so that they can continue to be on the map. And so we need to stabilize that infrastructure, and the government is going to need help to do that. So it's both human resources, but it's also financial resources to get the job done. And I'm going to zip through this. Health providers are first responders in trafficking cases, and they have special responsibilities to understand the problem, to identify victims, and to respond appropriately to help eradicate human trafficking. Thank you.
We're going to do a quick Q&A until about 10:10, which is about 14 minutes. I'll have a microphone that works. Does anyone want to be first?
Hi. My first question is actually for you specifically, because you just mentioned that we have this entire grant and this entire program that provides money for domestic violence and that goes into the shelters, but we don't have anything like that for trafficking. Would you recommend merging trafficking shelters and domestic violence shelters, or would that be a bad idea? So why?
I don't know, but we have these and well, Sarah, you might want to help with this also, because I know that Shared Hope is in the victim services business. I think it's a bad idea. I think it's a temporary fix, and I know in our first case in the U.S., when I was in the State Department, the Cadena case where 7 brothers were trafficking hundreds of women and children into Mexico, into these trailer brothels. One of those survivors that we talked to was one of those. They did put trafficking victims into domestic violence shelters because there were no other shelters. But the set of services for spousal abuse is just different than the set of services for trafficking victims. And so ultimately and eventually, we need homes and shelters and those kind of rehabilitation and restoration entities that are specifically designed for trafficking victims. There are security issues that you don't have in the same way with spousal abuse, and then there are just they've been raped over and over and over and over again, and so there are these kinds of health issues that we were talking about that just aren't the same.
Oh, I was going to say, I don't really have much to add to that. I think a lot of times when we're trying to craft new legislation and we're trying to look at best practices, sometimes a helpful starting place can be looking at domestic violence legislation and laws, because a lot of the same things that might be helpful in domestic violence cases are helpful in trafficking cases, but you definitely need a specialized trauma-informed response for trafficking victims. And so it's helpful, but it wouldn't holistically address the issue.
Hi, this question is for Ms. Lederer. If the healthcare providers are treated as the first responders in cases such as this, how do you ensure that these victims continue to reach out to healthcare providers, established ones, rather than going to backdoor healthcare providers?
Well, whenever there's that kind of quote-unquote backdoor illegal situation, we want to wipe that out. We want to eradicate it. And what we've found is that the best way to do that is to have those victims inform, and then we can go after those. Those are crimes that are being committed, and that kind of corruption in the healthcare system doesn't help anybody. I also heard a story of there was a trafficking ring where they just treated their victims brutally, and they were all terribly depressed, and they had a psychiatrist, this was in New York, who was on call, and she would just issue uppers and and downers. She would write prescriptions for uppers and write prescriptions for downers, and she was really a part of the trafficking ring, in that sense. And so that we have to weed out in the same way we would weed out the traffickers. And then I think the more we train health providers who are, just good people and legitimate providers to spot this, the better off we're going to be. And so I would put them in two separate categories. Did that answer the question?
Hello. So a lot of us in this room are going to be attorneys, and I don't think all of us will be going directly into this field. So is there any information or advice that you could give us as attorneys, and things that we could look for specifically, or ways that we can help in this area?
Well, I'm a JD, and I think that having the law degree opens up so many doors, because so much of what we do in our country to address problems like trafficking is, it's based on the law. And so even this, I published this article. I published it in the Annals of Health Law, the Loyola Annals of Health Law, because a lot of what we need to do is, if we really want to make change, yes, we have to get those first responders to know what to do. But really, we need to change the infrastructure, change the system, and that's where the law comes in. So we actually had, as a part of the Justice of Victims of Trafficking Act, Title 8 of that was about a mandatory training for health providers. We didn't have all the list of health providers, but so I think that the law can help in systems change. The law can help in and there are quite a few lawyers at Shared Hope, I think, that are working on at the state level, grading grading. So I think the best advice I can give you is just, it's fabulous you're in law school, and just know your stuff. There's the victim side, there's the law enforcement side, and there are these new arenas that are opening up, like in health law and others, and wherever you find yourself, there'll be something to do in trafficking. It is such a multidisciplinary problem, unfortunately, that we need help in all of the various aspects of the law.
Yeah, on legal change, I was really encouraged by what Sarah shared about 23 states who have improved their laws in certain areas, and just the improvement that's being made. In a lot of states, most states, I think, a huge portion of legislators are lawyers. Lawyers are in the place of helping make legal change all over. And so, legal change is one thing that lawyers can do. You're going to hear on the next panel of some people who are lawyers, a couple of whom are graduates of this law school, who have engaged as prosecutors on this. And so, engaging in prosecution, making sure that when people are arrested, they go to prison for this. Prosecutors who, when they're dealing with a prostitution case, ask the tough questions to be able to say, wait a second, how did this individual become engaged in prostitution? Are they a victim in this situation? As so often they are, make sure that the case is prosecuted in an appropriate way. And that's domestically, internationally. I think of one of our graduates, he went through the Center for Global Justice while he was here. He's now working in Nepal with a group called Love Justice International. And that's a group that until now hadn't done any prosecution or work with law enforcement. They just tried to be at the border in Nepal, the border with India, to try to see girls that they thought were being trafficked across the border to become prostitutes in India. And so they hired Kirk because he had done an internship with the Center for Global Justice, and he knew something about human trafficking. He's now a lawyer. Now, he's not able to prosecute cases in Nepal, but he's sure able to work with prosecutors there and using his legal skills in building a case, doing witness interviews, helping get witnesses prepared to testify at trial. And so he's using all those legal skills internationally. Even though he's not technically licensed in India, he's doing a lot of lawyerly things that help prosecutors be trafficked, or help them be prosecuted there.
Question for you. I understand that children in foster care are particularly at risk. Do you have any idea if they're doing anything at a federal level where Children's Services is concerned to address that?
As part of the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act, and there's another, the Strengthening Families and Preventing Trafficking Act of 2014, all aspects of all staff of the foster care systems in all the states have to be trained on trafficking. You're exactly right. I mean, I originally, 2012, 2013, we heard that foster care systems were suggesting, well, when you get victims, give them to us and we'll place them in foster care. And we said, oh no, not until foster care has a better system for identifying the problems within the foster care system, because they're terrible. I would say about 15 to 20% of the survivors that I interviewed were trafficked either by their foster parents or while they were in foster care by foster parents who just were clueless. And so we now have, it's actually an 11-hour training that there's training for administrators in the foster care system, training for the staff, and then training for foster care parents or potential parents. And it's in the pilot stage right now, so we'll have to see how that works. But that's another place where I think we need to do an evaluation and a study to see, what the problems are in foster care, and then whether this training is actually going to do the job we hope it will do. Training is only as good as, they say, there's the learning that goes on in the training, the retention, and then the application and the changed behavior. And those are the parts that we're not measuring yet in all of our trainings, so we need to do that.
And I would just add too, I don't have the states in front of me, but right now a lot of what I do focuses on bill tracking and kind of looking at legislation that's coming before all 50 states. And I do know that there are a number of bills that are introduced right now that are going through kind of the committees that are talking about mandating training for foster families to make sure that they understand trafficking and kind of the issues and special needs of these children.
I just wanted to respond or piggyback on two comments made. First of all, what we've learned in the Tidewater area with regard to victims of trafficking is the victims of sexual assault, domestic violence, and human trafficking really need to be housed in separate facilities. They have different sets of needs. There's a different dynamic. And what one of the shelters has experienced is that some of the victims of trafficking become very violently aggressive towards the victims of domestic violence or sexual assault. You need to understand prostitution is a territorial business. When you're out on the streets, you do not allow anybody to come on your turf because you're responsible for making a certain amount of money every evening when you're put out there. And so victims of trafficking for sexual assault carry that territoriality into shelters, and it really complicates. It puts a shelter in the position of having to protect other residents against. Plus, the current shelters here are experiencing what they call bottom ladies, people who are street prostitutes who want to move up in the trafficking structure, getting themselves admitted to shelter so that they can try and recruit back victims of trafficking who've been bonded out to the shelter, or so that they can recruit victims of domestic violence into the trafficking scheme. So mixing those populations is just not a recipe for success. I mean, we're finding by trial and error what needs to be done and what needs to be resourced. Second, the foster care system in this country has been a broken system for 2 decades. There are some states that have been put under a receivership because of the number of children injured or who died in foster care. So I think realistically, for those children who are under age of emancipation, that system needs to be repaired. Not only do we need to train foster care placements, but we need to recognize that for some people, it's a cash cow business. Children are warehoused there. They're not cared for, they're not provided for, which incentivizes the children to run away. The second is that most states do not have a system in place that when children age out of foster care, there's something for them to transition into. I cannot tell you how many times I've heard of children who aged out of foster care were handed their belongings in a shopping bag. That should tell you something, that all of their belongings could be held in a large shopping bag. And the CASA workers who had worked with those children saw some of the women out on the streets prostituting within a year after they aged out of the foster care system. So we need to look at all of the pieces of the puzzle together. We need to figure out how we synchronize them so that we truly not only prevent, but we effectively remediate the injury that's done to those who are victims of trafficking, both as minors and as adults.
So beautifully said, Professor McKee. Thank you so much. And I think that there's this CYA, cover your whatever, that goes on in these systems that are broken. And until we can fix that, we're really going to continue to have problems.